Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown. I have a special guest with me here today, Ben Norton. And, you know, first off, I want to say welcome to the Takedown, and we're subverting power, radical thought. That's what we do here every day. And, of course, today is going to be a sensitive topic because we're going to basically rebel against the common narrative that's going on, as far as U.S. policy in Syria or the Middle East in general. So I have Ben Norton. Why don't you say hello to our guest? Ben, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself to our guests and say hello.
Hey, I'm Ben. Thanks for listening, and I'm glad to be here. It's going to be an exciting discussion.
Yeah, so we're just going to start right into it. Like, there's a lot of stuff to get here. And before we start the conversation, what I want to say is, just as I said before, when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, most of what we hear as common knowledge or like oft repeated stuff, like stuff that's just repeated over and over and over again, a lot of times, a lot of that stuff isn't true. So let's kind of focus that in on the Middle East and Syria in particular. What would you say we should start? I think starting from Syria's history and kind of how they got to this point would be a good one if we can do a broad brush overview.
Well, it's important to understand that the Middle East was arbitrarily divided 100 years ago. So if we're going to talk about Western foreign policy in the Middle East, it's important to start actually in 1916. So at the end of World War I, Western colonial powers arbitrarily divided the region up based on their own political interests. And the most famous example of this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was agreed to 101 years ago. Last year was the centenary of it. And in this case, you had the foreign ministers of France and Britain meeting and working together to carve up the former Ottoman lands. So at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, was carved up. And this agreement that was written, known as Sykes-Picot, named after the foreign ministers, essentially created these arbitrary boundaries that we're living with today. So Syria, as a country, was only created through this kind of colonial division. It's very similar to the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, in which European powers also arbitrarily divided up Africa. So they did something very similar to the Middle East 30 years later. And I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that the conflicts we're facing are products of this, but it's important to understand that when we're talking about political conflicts in the Middle East, they're in no way independent from Western imperial influence, because especially since the 1930s, when oil was discovered in the region, which is the most oil-dense part of the planet, this has been an area where colonial powers, traditional colonizing nations, have played a very influential role in politics and have dominated, many peoples in this area for decades. And in the war in Syria, this, of course, is the violent outgrowth of the 2011 uprisings. So in late 2010, in December 2010, in Tunisia, North Africa, a Tunisian street vendor by the name Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire in protest of the government's corruption, police harassment, and such. And that act of self-immolation was a kind of spark that lit a larger conflagration that led to the rise of a lot of these movements. And I'm not, of course, saying that the only reason people were protesting is because this guy set himself on fire. Rather, that was kind of the shot heard around the world, right? So World War I did not break out just because an archduke was murdered. It was the buildup over years and years of political, differences and contradictions. And of course, many countries in the Middle East are repressive, many are police states, many are corrupt, and many have been imposing neoliberal right-wing economic policies for many years now, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and the domination of capitalism throughout the world, and the Washington Consensus as the only model to govern. Fukuyama, the political scientist, famously said that we are heralding in the so-called end of history. Bourgeois capitalist liberal democracy is the only form of government. And so you had the rise of young populaces in many of these countries. You had huge rates of unemployment, of poverty, skyrocketing inequality, and it burst, right? The problem is, in some of these countries that had protests, the US and its allies supported the protests. In others, they supported the crackdown on the protests. And of course, whether or not they did so depends on their own political interests. So to make things really simple, in the countries in the Middle East in 2011 that had uprisings that were US allies, the US tended to oppose the protests and to support the regime crushing the protesters. So in the case of Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain, those are the great examples of how you had massive protests where the US said that it supported democracy, but it actually sided with these dictatorial regimes. So the biggest example is Egypt. You know, everyone talks about the Egyptian revolution. Mubarak, who was a US-backed dictator for 29 years, was eventually ousted, but the US position was essentially opposed to the protesters until the final moments. And then when it was clear in February 2011 that Mubarak was going to be ousted and not going to be able to stay in power, then the US sided with the protesters. That's also true for Tunisia with the dictator Ben Ali. And Bahrain is perhaps the most extreme example of the hypocrisy. In Bahrain, which is a tiny country in the Gulf, there were massive protests. In fact, many people estimate that the protests in Bahrain were the largest protests in all of the 2011 uprisings, known as the Arab Spring. However, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, sent 2,000 troops into Bahrain to crush the uprising violently. They sent in helicopters and all of this heavy artillery, in similar ways actually to what it looked like when heavily militarized police here in the U.S. cracked down on protests against police brutality. So those protests were not supported. However, in Syria and Libya, which have traditionally for decades been enemies of the U.S. during the Cold War, they don't have military bases. These are countries that, again, have problems internally, but are also not part of the neoliberal Washington consensus. They don't vote with the U.S. at the UN, etc. These are the countries where the U.S. supported protests. And of course, in 2011, in March 2011, NATO militarily intervened in Libya, ostensibly to protect, in humanitarian reasons, to protect civilians. But in reality, we know that the goal was regime change from the very beginning. And in 2011, NATO violently toppled the government of the longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi. And eventually, he was brutally murdered by extremist rebels who sodomized him with a bayonet, brutally on camera, after the U.S. bombed his convoy and he fled from his convoy. So the U.S. overthrew Libya's government in 2011, and today the country is in absolute turmoil. Actually, there was a recent report that found that African migrants and refugees are actually being sold in open slave markets in Libya now. So this is the free Libya that NATO helped to create through military intervention. In the eastern part of the country, women have been banned from traveling on their own. And, the country is still roiling from violence. There's still a civil war. Thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been displaced. And it's helped set off the refugee crisis, which we always talk about, but we never hear the reasons for. So, I mean, this sets the ground for the conflict in Syria.
Let me come in here and say a few things. You said a whole bunch there, and like I had comments for like each individual part, but I couldn't make it all. So let's start with the person who said we've heralded the end of history. I want to make it clear that whenever we've reached something that the elite are particularly happy with, there'll always be theorists and people who serve them in a sense on the intellectual side that are going to talk about how where we've arrived is inevitable and this is the best it's going to be and there is nothing else. There is no alternative. That is a big thing that they always push out there. This is the same thing they said about feudalism. You'll find that there were a lot of political theorists who said the same thing about feudalism and so on and so on. So, here we are coming full circle. And now, basically they're saying the same thing about the New World Order or the neoliberal global hegemonic presence that the United States has now. We all know that that's not true. Like if history were to end, we'd all be dead. There's nobody here. There's no moving parts, right? But I want to piggyback off of that and say that when you talk about Libya, the invasion of Libya, what brings to my mind was Libya had a disarmament agreement with the United States a long time ago to cease seeking a nuclear program, I believe. they actually stopped seeking that nuclear program. And then, consequently 4, 5, 6 years later, boom, there they are, target for regime change. What exactly do you think Libya and Syria have done more than just not voting with the United States at the UN? Because not everybody votes with them at the UN. Sometimes the United States is the only person.
Yeah,
at
most
the
of the
UN
world
in
doesn't
same
vote with
name.
the U.S. at the UN.
Yeah,
That's just one example of the point.
Yeah. Well, what do you think really makes them a target for regime change as opposed to other nations besides for that?
Well, I mean, the answers are different depending on the country, right? So this answer is different for Syria. I'll bring Libya here.
Okay.
So first of all, it's important to preface by noting that a scholarly study, an academic scientific study, recently found that the chances of a foreign government militarily intervening in a war in a foreign nation are 100 times higher if that foreign nation has large oil reserves. In the case of Libya, oil is, of course, a very important factor. It's not the only factor. There are other factors. So it's not just about oil. No war is just about oil. But when countries have large oil resources and other natural resources, that's, of course, an important factor to consider. Also, Libya was important. Muammar Gaddafi was a very interesting figure who went through different political phases that kind of reflect the global political changes. So during the Cold War, he was in the non-aligned movement, but leaned toward the Soviet axis. The Libyan government under Gaddafi during the Cold War supported many resistance movements and anti-colonial movements throughout not just the Middle East, but the world. So he was famous for his ties actually to Irish rebels fighting British colonialism. He also supported Palestinians who were resisting illegal Israeli occupation and ethnic cleansing. So he was, under Gaddafi, Libya was known for supporting many resistance movements. That was during the Cold War. Also, it was a socialist government that provided very strong social services for all of its citizens. It wasn't part of the neoliberal US-dominated economic system. And after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of socialism, the destruction of socialism, I mean, it didn't just collapse on its own, it was violently destroyed in wars. It's important to understand that.
Yes.
After that, Libya, it still maintained a strong welfare state, strong social services. It began adopting more capitalist reforms, like most governments in the world, but still, it was not part of, it was not dominated by Wall Street. It didn't use the same, financial system in the dollar, etc. Gaddafi was actually discussing a potential Pan-African currency that was based on gold. So, I mean, these are all, there's not one reason that the U.S. pursued and its allies pursued regime change in Libya. Also, France was very interested in pursuing regime change in Libya. And actually, France originally led the call for NATO intervention. North Africa has traditionally been a so-called sphere of influence for France in terms of imperialism. And France wanted to exert more political and economic control over this region. So there are a lot of factors. In Syria,
before you talk about Syria, let me ask some questions here in regards to Libya. Now, I've read some, or listened to some lectures by some people, and they've said that one of the things the United States does not tolerate, as best it can. It really doesn't like to have anybody trying to do any kind of nationalist plans in that region. Anybody that wants to decide to use their resources for their own benefit, it seems like anathema to them, to policymakers here.
Absolutely, and especially when they're looking more broadly and trying to make international coalitions. In the case of Gaddafi, again, Gaddafi had a lot of problems. There were internal problems with corruption. There was repression in the Libyan state. It wasn't by no means saying that it didn't have valid criticisms. However, Gaddafi also was interested in Pan-Africanism. That was a very important part of his politics for many years, which of course is very dangerous to Western imperial powers, which have long divided Africa and prevented any kind of unity in the continent, which is the largest continent in the world. There's very little discussion of that. I mean, actually, it's very interesting to see all these maps. Basically, every map in the West we see minimizes the size of Africa. And that's a legacy of European colonialism and Eurocentrism, etc. But Gaddafi was an important voice for Pan-Africanism, for unity of the global South, like working together as governments to form our own economic institutions and banks, to create our own currency, to pursue a form of economic development that is not controlled by these neoliberal institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Yep,
So,
yep. That's
absolutely.
Almost separating himself from the world order in a sense, right? And I think South America, they're experimenting or flirting with something similar. But I didn't want to derail you totally.
No, it's a very important point. Latin America is also a great example. The BRICS Bank recently is another good example where, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa were, made a new bank. And like these attempts are direct challenges to the Wall Street World Bank dominated economic order. And that doesn't mean, use this phrase, and I'm not saying use it in this way, but unfortunately, there are sometimes right-wingers who use these talking points, but they articulate a conspiracy. There's not a conspiracy. There's no New World Order in the sense of there are people pulling strings. Rather, it's an economic system that was created by Western capitalist institutions to maintain imperial domination. This is a global economic system. It's not a cabal of a dozen men who are pulling strings. So
yeah, I think that's the word we use to kind of phrase it. But the way you describe it is exactly what we're referring to when we say things like that. The global stability or the New World Order or the neoliberal hegemonic presence, whatever that is, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this precise set of economic institutions and structures that create this system. And we have, small regions or individual countries trying to get out from under that. I think Michael Parenti once wrote that, it's a strange thing that we use terms like, developing nation or things like that, when we really should be using, overexploited nations or underdeveloped or deindustrialized for the nations that are poor, the nations that are rich. And I speak about this a lot of times when I talk about wealth and, wealth and poverty and how they're interrelated. But to go back, I think we were speaking about why was Syria particularly targeted for regime change. Before we go and start talking about economics, I talk about that all day. But this is very important that we understand, kind of like why Syria was necessarily targeted. And then we start to talk about the common narratives that are going on there. But first, let's answer the first question.
Well, for similar reasons. Of course, natural resources are always an element. And in Syria, I think it's less of a factor than it was in Libya. Syria does not have large oil reserves. However, of course, Syria is very geopolitically strategic, and there have been discussions for gas and oil pipelines going through Syria for some years. So that's always part of it, but that's not the main factor. Anyone who looks at a war and says it's about one thing is grossly oversimplifying things. For instance, in Iraq, oil was an important part of the invasion of Iraq, but it was by no means a war only for oil. And in Syria, it's more important to look at Syria's political alliances. So Syria is a close ally of Iran. And now, it has traditionally been an ally of Russia, but in the past few years in particular, it's grown closer to Russia. Of course, Iran is public enemy number one for the US, even under the Trump administration. The Trump administration claimed that it wanted to pursue rapprochement with Russia in some way. It may seek to do so, although tensions have actually increased recently. But Iran has always remained the bipartisan enemy number one, always the target for regime change. So several years ago, Wesley Clark, a U.S. general, acknowledged that when he was in the Bush administration, they had drafted a list of countries to be targeted for regime change. And he said,
did they call it the axis of evil, right? Is that what they called it?
Yeah. Well, Bush famously named the axis of evil, of course, and Iran is the primary culprit. Also Iraq, Syria, North Korea, etc. And the Wesley Clark said that there were 7 countries targeted for regime change that they hoped to overthrow in 5 years. It's taken much longer than 5 years, but the U.S. has actually been pretty successful. So Libya was one of those countries. Libya as a state has been functionally destroyed. There are multiple competing governments internally. Syria was a target for regime change. Syria, it's a complete tragedy what has happened to this country. It has been absolutely wrecked. Half the population has been displaced. 5 million people are external refugees. Thousands upon thousands have been killed. Iraq has, of course, been overthrown. And if you go to those 7 countries, the cherry on top that the U.S. wanted to pursue regime change in is Iran. And Syria is an important ally of Iran. Iran has been backing the Syrian government, has been sending forces in, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, advising the Syrian army in its fight against rebels, which are backed by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and of course the US and the UK. So Syria politically is not a Western ally. It's an ally of the West's enemies. And the US has pursued regime change in Syria for some years. So we now have WikiLeaks documents, internal government cables that show that in the mid-2000s, the US was already pursuing regime change in Syria through a few different ways. It was supporting opposition groups and opposition media. The US was actually encouraging sectarian tension internally inside Syria on religious and ethnic lines. And Syria is a very diverse country. It has a dozen religions. It has many different ethnic minority groups, including the Kurds, Yazidis, Assyrians, you go on the list. And for more than a decade, the US has been pursuing regime change. And again, Syria is a country that, like most other countries in the region, it is repressive. It has an authoritarian government, but it's not uniquely repressive or uniquely authoritarian. What's unique about it is it's not an ally of the US and Israel. It's not following orders, and it's allied with the enemies of the US and its allies. And again, it also has, although I'm not certainly defending the authoritarian elements of its government, it does have a very strong welfare state. It has very strong social services for its people, and it has an economic nationalist program that although Bashar al-Assad, the leader, the president of Syria, he has worked a little bit more with these institutions like the World Bank, but even then, the government does not impose neoliberal capitalist right-wing policies, and it's not open to the kind of economic exploitation by Western corporations that other governments in the region are.
And I think those last 3 reasons, like, for me, they just stand out. Like, I think Noam Chomsky said the threat of a good example, or the threat of an ulterior way of managing or developing your economy, that those can't be tolerated under the way the current things are set up. So a lot of the times, that's what really marks you for things like regime change, destabilization. But what's interesting is that you said they've been targeted for almost the better part of 2000, 2010, like long before the uprising or really the Arab Spring really rose and kind of spread throughout the area. So that means, what happened there could just be something that's taken advantage of by the powers that be, so to speak, or policymakers here in the United States.
Absolutely. And, well, it's twofold, right? I said earlier that during the so-called Arab Spring, and also I think we should problematize the phrase the Arab Spring. Columbia professor, Joseph Massaad, who teaches here at Columbia University, he wrote an article in Al Jazeera, and the headline is, I believe, the Arab Spring and Other American Seasons. And he takes issue with the whole framework, and he's like, this is the whole notion that this is a kind of unified Arab Spring movement is a product of the media. It's a fabrication, and it also is an attempt to take the counter-revolutions in Eastern Europe, the right-wing movements in Eastern Europe, and to impose them onto the Middle East as this kind of example of, these movements. So, but even that aside, looking at the response of the U.S. is very revealing. So again, as I said, the U.S. supported protests in countries that were enemies and opposed protests in countries that were its allies. And in the case of Syria, I'm not in any way implying that there were no legitimate protests. There were legitimate protests. Like every government in the region, there were legitimate protests. There were also protests in Saudi Arabia. We never hear about the protests in Saudi Arabia, like in the east of the part of the country, especially in this the area known as Qatif. There were large protests that were similarly violently crushed and got almost no coverage in the Western media.
Let me ask you a question about the protests in Saudi Arabia. I remember hearing some reporting that while those protests were going on, what the royal family decided to do was, open up, several $billions in, aid and relief to sort of like cut some of the support for the protests. And then before the crackdown, did you hear anything like that?
Well, yeah, actually, many governments did something very similar. So a lot of these protests have been motivated, as we're discussing, by serious economic problems. Poverty is on the rise. Crippling austerity measures have been imposed by a lot of these institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which, for decades imposed so-called structural adjustment programs on countries in the global south, telling them they have to get rid of social services in order to pay off their debts. So there are serious problems that many of these people throughout the Middle East have been facing, and they were rightfully protesting. In the case of Saudi Arabia did cut back on some austerity measures. It did provide some more social services and basically pay some people off to stifle some of the protests. But it also, like in Bahrain and elsewhere, it also used violence to crush some of the protests. So the notion that the Syrian government was unique in the violent repression of protests is false. It is true that the Syrian government did use some violence to repress protesters. What got much less coverage in the Western media is there were also people from the beginning who were using violence against the Syrian government, killing police officers and setting fire to government buildings.
Oh, so wait. When you say this, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I know of what you speak, but so you mean to tell me that these protests were not all nonviolent and that some of the protests there did turn out violent and they did have, kind of violence going on there, and it wasn't just all peaceful?
Absolutely. And there are actually mainstream media reports at the time that acknowledge this. Of course, the whitewashed history that we've been spoon-fed in the past few years is that, these were completely peaceful uprisings and blah, blah, blah. Again, I'm not denying that there were legitimate protests. There were legitimate protests, but also among the legitimate protests were people who were committed to violently overthrowing the government. Many of these people were hardline Salafi jihadists who are extremists who see Shia Muslims as non-Muslims. And it's important to understand that in Syria, 13% of the population is Shia. The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni, but Iran and Iraq are two of the only countries that have Shia majority populations, and Syria has a significant Shia minority. And the Assad family is Alawite, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. So from the beginning, there were hardline sectarians who were portraying this as a sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia, and they were claiming that the Syrian government is a so-called Alawite government that's ruled on behalf of the Shia, even though the government is secular and non-sectarian. And they were using this, and yes, they used violence. So even if you read mainstream reports, they would acknowledge things at the end of the article, of course, where no one ever reads. But they'll acknowledge that, oh yes, these protesters in Daraa in the south or in other parts, they set fire to government buildings. And this is actually very extreme. Again, I'm not justifying the government crackdown. There was a violent government crackdown. However, if you were in the US and you had protesters setting fire to courthouses, as happened in Syria, and murdering people in the streets, of course you're going to expect some kind of violent crackdown. Again, I'm not saying that all of it's justified, but I'm saying the narrative that we all often hear is very whitewashed, and they cherry pick some details in order to push for regime change.
Let me come in here, and I want to state this. Just because we're pointing out that the mainstream propaganda is not accurate, that doesn't mean that we wholeheartedly support Assad. Being against U.S. imperial ambitions or being against the way the global situation is set up right now does not mean that you automatically support dictators or whatever else. That's one of the hugest fallacies that you encounter when you speak to people. You're like, well, that guy's not good anyway. It's like, well, wait a minute. People have the right to decide, what goes on in their own nation. We don't have the right to just, oh, we don't like this guy, we pick this guy off, or we don't like that guy, we pick that guy off. We don't know anything about that country. We don't know anything about those people. all we're doing is making decisions off a spoon-fed, like you said, like we're just making decisions off this spoon-fed, whitewashed history without really knowing what's going on in the country. And to be honest with you, it's better that we try to avoid doing that as much as possible. But, back to my original point, being against U.S. imperialism does not mean you're automatically pro the subject that's on the other end. It's not a binary option.
Absolutely. And the great example of this is Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a very repressive dictator, and he was actually supported by the U.S. throughout the 1980s. That's almost never acknowledged. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Iran and Iraq were at each other's throats. Throughout the 1980s, there was a horrific war where more than 1 million people were killed, the Iran-Iraq War. The U.S. staunchly supported Saddam Hussein. The U.S. provided chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein that he used against Iranians. He was our ally. But then, of course, in 1990, in the Gulf War, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and he became an enemy again. So looking at the hypocrisy of the U.S., it's very clear. If you opposed regime change in Iraq, it didn't make you pro-Saddam, even though many people who claimed that many people smeared Iraq war opponents as Saddam supporters, just as today they're smearing us all as Assadists. And this is also actually something that's very misleading, because what's never acknowledged, again, the Syrian government is repressive, but every other government in the region is also repressive, and many are even more repressive, including close U.S. allies. So we'll constantly hear in the U.S. media that we're supporting freedom and democracy and these moderate rebels in Syria, even though there are very few moderate rebels, and there haven't been for years.
Can I make a comment real quick?
Absolutely.
I think that that's probably one of the most insidious claims, because, I mean, to be honest with you, they had a democracy in the 50s, or around, 49 or so, and what's that? What's the guy's name? Kowatli?
Yeah, well,
I believe.
Yeah, this is true throughout the region. The most famous example everyone cites is in 1953, the CIA organized a coup in Iran to topple the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh.
Yeah.
And it was on behalf of the oil companies.
I believe in Syria, though, they had Kowatli that was democratically overthrown. The Truman administration authorized a coup in 49. From like 49 to 55 or so, it was like the United States had their guy, and I guess like nationalist coalitions had their guy, various people. And they kind of had a tug of war, and then somehow around 55, I think Kowatli came back again. But eventually, the civilian-led control of the government kind of fell to the wayside a little bit, and you end up with what we have now. Something like that. It's antecedent, so to speak.
Well, throughout the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, the U.S. supported a variety of coups throughout the Middle East, also in Latin America. Every few years, the leader is overthrown. This happened in Iraq as well. And in the 1960s, there were coups by the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party was a socialist party, but it was not necessarily allied with the Soviet Union, and it was Arab nationalist. And there was a split in the 60s between the Iraqi and Syrian Ba'athist parties. Both of them had Ba'athist governments. And still today, the Syrian government is ruled by the Ba'ath Party. And in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party was overthrown, and there was a process of de-Ba'athification. But a point I was going to make a moment ago really quickly, what's never acknowledged, you'll see people, talking heads on the U.S. media, talking about the importance of supporting freedom and democracy in Syria. But what they never acknowledge is, when are we going to support freedom and democracy in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar or in these countries that are close U.S. allies? In fact, what's crazy is you'll see the most extreme propaganda of all is you'll see lobbyists on behalf of Saudi Arabia and Qatar going on TV and claiming they support freedom and democracy in Syria. But it's like, when are they going to support freedom and democracy in their own countries? This is absolutely preposterous. Saudi Arabia is a very close U.S. ally. The Obama administration did more than $115 billion of arms deals, $115 billion with a B, with Saudi Arabia in its 8 years. The Trump administration has continued selling arms to Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration has repeatedly held meetings and talks with members of the Saudi regime, including Saudi King Salman, Deputy Crown Prince. You go down the list. So the hypocrisy is very extreme, and it doesn't mean that you support Assad. It is just like it doesn't mean that you supported Saddam Hussein, but we should absolutely oppose regime change because for decades, Western imperial countries have tried to continue to divide the Middle East up in order to control the politics of the region and the natural resources. And we've seen the complete disasters that have been the result of that.
Let me broad brush something really, really quickly. I think everybody in the United States, and particularly on the left, what we have to understand is that when people use things like the national interest, we have to understand that when people say it's in our interest or U.S. is just following its own interests, those interests are largely divorced from what's good for us as the populace. Those interests are not related in the least. The national interests of the United States are the interests of the wealthy people who own the society. That's what that interest is about. And their interests are not your interests. So we should not ever be in support of U.S. imperial interests as long as the national interest is separated from our own personal interests. You know, and that's what we have right now. So if you acknowledge that corporations and rich people have too much control in our government, you should also understand that that control in government extends to control of the military and control of how we interact with other nations around the world. And then we also should understand that other nations have a similar issue. The wealthy people also control their national interests to some degree. That's something that we should understand as a baseline. You know, so when we start imbibing these things like, oh, well, you know, empire is inevitable, or, you know, the United States fell into this leadership of the role. Fell into this leadership role in the world by happenstance. We have to understand that our hero, FDR, was instrumental in setting up a lot of these things. And this stuff is, you know, not good for us at all. And so we have somebody who was, you know, maybe better on domestic policy, but on foreign policy, you know, he laid a lot of the groundwork for American empire. And I think the left really has to start pushing back against that, because only we can constrain it. Only the populace in America can restrain those forces. We're the only people that can do it. But so long as we're allowing it to go on and saying that's inevitable and there's nothing we can do, it continues. And what I will say is, it's not that our opinion is not important. It's just that so many of us just don't pay attention to it, don't internalize what it means, that we don't focus upon it, that it's allowed to go on like this.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Ben.
And a great example of this, just to interject for a moment, is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, of course, when it comes to domestic issues, is proposing so many great things that I support. Universal health care. It's preposterous that the U.S. is the only country in the industrialized world that doesn't have universal health care. Free public higher education, you know, paid maternity leave. These are all basic social programs the government should have been providing for decades. And I 100% support that. And on those issues, I think Bernie Sanders is incredibly important and his voice is great. However, Bernie Sanders is not perfect. And he's, at the end of the day, he's actually not really that left wing. He's a European style social democrat. But politics in the US have shifted so far to the right in the past several decades that anyone who is to the left of the center is seen as a radical. And when it comes to foreign policy, this is where some of Bernie Sanders' weaknesses come out. Again, Sanders has done a lot of great things, and he's, you know, helped create a movement, and that's great, a movement of progressives throughout the country who are being involved in activism. However, when it comes to foreign policy, you know, Bernie Sanders has supported wars, including the NATO war in Yugoslavia, which destroyed Yugoslavia as a nation. He supported the funding for the war in Afghanistan. He opposed the Iraq war, which is great. But, you know, he supported Libya, intervention in Libya. And, you know, these are things that many liberals went on board with. You know, a lot of liberals oppose the Iraq war. That's a very easy thing to oppose. The hard thing is to oppose all forms of military intervention, including the ones that are disguised as humanitarian intervention, even though they're almost never about humanitarian intervention. They're actually, at the end of the day, about exercising political control and corporate profits.
You should probably repeat that. Like, I like what you said when you said, you know, when they cloak war in humanitarianism or something like that, we should understand that, you know, war never, ever really is about humanitarian reasons. Those are what they call pretexts, right? So that's never really why we're there. That's just a pretext that they use. So I think that that's super important. And I like how you pointed out that Bernie Sanders did support Libya. And what's interesting is that's something he tried to kind of shy away from, you know, in the debate against Hillary Clinton, you know, when she correctly stuck him with that. And it was very, very funny.
And I'll say Sanders has learned a lot. Throughout the campaign, he spoke more about regime change. And the fact that we had someone on a stage in a major political debate using the word regime change and discussing the history of US-backed coups is remarkable. So I give him credit for that. But he still has a really long way to go. And we should be firm and uncompromising and even critical when it comes to these issues. And if Bernie Sanders comes out in support of intervention in places like Syria, and he's been flip-flopping, we should be critical. You can be critically supportive, but still critical.
And here we have Bernie Sanders going out there and supporting this narrative that somehow the Assad regime has used this chemical weapons attack, you know, even though nothing has been confirmed by anybody, and nobody's been able to confirm both that it was for sure 100% a chemical weapons attack, and then on top of that, for sure it was done by the Assad regime. You know, I believe we had maybe like I wouldn't say a false flag, maybe like the opposition used the chemical attack and tried to frame the main government with that in 2013. And this is still repeated today, that, you know, he used chemical weapons in 2013, when the report that actually came out finds that actually wasn't the Assad regime that actually did that.
Well, yeah, so this is in reference to an attack in Ghouta in 2013. And the allegations made by Western governments was that the Syrian government used sarin gas in this area east of Damascus and killed hundreds of civilians. What investigations later showed is that narrative is actually likely false. To be clear, the UN had an investigative team that did not actually apportion blame. They confirmed that sarin gas was used in the attack, but they didn't say who was responsible. And actually, a member of the UN team said it was rebels who did it. Well, fast forward later, after more than a year, Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who is known for exposing U.S. massacres in Vietnam. He also exposed Abu Ghraib and torture of Iraqi prisoners by the U.S. A very well-respected journalist published two reports. One was called Who's Sarin Gas, and the other's report is called Red Line, Rat Line, exposing that the likely culprit behind the gas attack in 2013 in Ghouta were Syrian al-Qaeda, known as Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra likely got the sarin gas from Turkey. And we now know Turkey for years was supporting extremist groups inside Syria, including Jabhat al-Nusra, Syrian al-Qaeda, because they were trying to topple the Syrian government. In fact, for years, Turkey was allowing people to cross its border from ISIS, allowing people from throughout the world to cross its border to go join ISIS, and allowing ISIS fighters to go in and out while they were fighting the Kurds in the north. So there's a lot of reason to be suspicious, because these previous accusations the U.S. made without any evidence were proven to be false.
Yeah, I think that's what I want to get to. That all that background information was 100%, because I had not done all the legwork I needed to basically go through each and every detail like you did. That was perfect, and that's why I thank you for coming on this show to provide that information, because I'm just a one-man show, and I don't, you know, I'm a grad student. And I work a full-time job. I don't necessarily have the time to put in that much research. But
no, it's great that you're doing it. Thanks so much. This is a great show.
I think that that's super important. And what's key in what you said there is, you know, the last time these allegations were made, they were proven to be fraudulent, or at least not factual, right? So now when it happens again, you know, the United States, for some reason, our populace sometimes spoon-fed by our media. We have like an amnesia. You know, 2013 is not that long ago. That was just 4 years ago. That's really not that long ago. We should remember the last time that they alleged these things and it didn't pan out to be truthful. So forgive me for not believing them the second time that they have something similar occur. This is a pattern. You know, they put out a story. They repeat it enough times, repetition. People believe it as fact, and then it turns out to be wholly false. Like, am I wrong for acknowledging that history and just being skeptical the next time they do it?
If I can add a quick point, absolutely. We should always be skeptical of everything. I memean, the famous muckraking journalist I.F. Stone said, all governments lie, and the U.S. government is no different. I'll add one quick point here. I don't want to deny in any way that the Syrian government has committed war crimes, and we should acknowledge that the Syrian government has, done some really bad things, and that's why we should be anti-war. We're anti-war because war is horrible for everyone on both sides. Everyone in war on both sides commits war crimes. In World War II, the Allies, who were absolutely justified in their fight against fascism and helped save the world from fascism, they also committed war crimes. They firebombed Dresden. They bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We should absolutely condemn these crimes. So I'm not denying in any way that the Syrian government has committed war crimes, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And saying that the Syrian government intentionally used chemical weapons on people who are supportive of it in an area that's dominated by Al-Qaeda-aligned rebels is preposterous. And we need extraordinary evidence to back up those extraordinary claims. And if there is no extraordinary evidence, then we should be skeptical.
Yes. And don't get me wrong. I'm not a supporter of the Assad regime. I'm just anti-U.S. intervention and anti-imperialism. That's just one thing. The Syrian regime, like you said, is characteristic of governments in that region, but it's there as blowback to our interference there to begin with. That's generally what that is. So I think
we should be asking ourselves, if people truly want more freedoms and more reforms for the Syrian people, what is the best way to do that? And the best way to do that is not violently toppling its government and letting the country be controlled by roving gangs of Salafi jihadist militants who are not under any organized political leadership, because that's what's happening in the country. Regime change, as happened in Libya and has happened in Iraq, leads to complete chaos and death and suffering. So if you really do care about the Syrian people's suffering, you should not support regime change.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. I agree with that, and I also want to make it clear that the United States is not interested in democracy. that is not what the United States is interested in, and we don't even have that here. They have a lot of things in place to make sure we really don't have democracy here in America, and we're the populace that supposedly has the ability to control it. So what makes us believe that they are interested in democracy for other people? They're not. This is just geopolitical things that they're considering. They have an interest and they have an agenda, and they're following that, and that's largely divorced from what we want. That's largely divorced from what the populace needs or what our interests are, and it's largely devoid of humanitarian concern.
Absolutely.
So I think what I also want to say about this is we have to think about in regards to this chemical weapons attack, we have to think about, what does that mean? It seems that lately in the conflict that it seems like Assad may have, or the Assad coalition may have started to gain an upper hand against the rebels. And then if that is the case, why would they then resort to doing something like a chemical weapons attack, which would then give pretext for more outside intervention from the opposition?
No, absolutely. That's the question. And there's been very misleading coverage on Syria for years, but recently the misinformation has spiked. And I think that's a product of a few things. In late 2016, the Syrian government retook Aleppo. And the reporting on Aleppo was very misleading. Aleppo was, before the conflict began in Syria, the largest city in the country. Unfortunately, with the population fleeing and the massive displacement of people inside and outside of the country, it's hard to know. But Aleppo is a very important major city in Syria. And the way it was discussed in media reports was that, okay, this was the center of the revolution. It was the heart of the uprising. But actually, even if you go back and read mainstream media reports, for instance, a 2012 The Guardian article I often Syria because they weren't afraid at that moment of being kidnapped by no reporters who were actually on the ground these days. But back in 2012, these reporters interviewed people in Aleppo, and they admitted, even rebel supporters admitted, that the uprising was not popular in Aleppo, and they estimated that some 70% of the city's inhabitants supported the government.
Wait, let me interrupt you there for a second. And you remember all these videos that like I was gonna die, they're coming to kill everybody, and you know I'm here. These are my last words from Aleppo and all that. Do you remember that huge campaign?
And then a week later, they release a new video, and they're in Idlib.
Yes. I just remember like all these videos about these people saying their last words to their loved ones in Aleppo and all of those things. And we had like you know, the Human Rights Campaign or Human Rights Watch. It was a Human Rights Watch and I can't remember. See, this is why I don't like to do stuff, you know, off the cuff like this. I would have had that. That would have been perfect. Well, here, I'll add something. I'm not Noam Chomsky. Go ahead.
One of the people whose videos was cited in this is a man by the name of Bilal Abdul Karim, who's a very interesting character, who's from New York. He's an American, and he is essentially a propagandist for Al-Qaeda. He has extensive ties to Al-Qaeda, and he has interviewed its leaders inside Syria. He's released all these videos for this project he has called On the Ground News. And he makes all this propaganda claiming that Shia are not really Muslims, claiming that the conflict in Syria is a religious conflict between Sunni and Shia. And he posted this video saying, "This is my last video, I'm saying goodbye." And it was cited on CNN and all these mainstream media outlets. And then a week later, he was back in Idlib. Idlib is dominated by Al-Qaeda. It's the last rebel-held province in Syria. And seeing all these mainstream media outlets, including the New York Times, which published a whitewashed profile on Bilal Abdul Karim, they all echoed his claims. And again, this is not a neutral observer. This is someone who has been embedded inside Al-Qaeda for years. And they're the ones whose claims are being propagated by mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, see, that is exactly what I'm talking about. And it's not hard to put this stuff together, folks. It just takes time. And thank God Ben has the time and he's gotten off in there and done this kind of work. And what I was referring to was a debate on Democracy Now! Between Stephen Cohen and Kenneth Roth from Human Rights Watch. And if you watch that debate, I believe Stephen Cohen was definitely on the right, well, what I would say is he was on the right track with how we should be approaching the media reports and things coming out of Syria.
And for some background, Cohen is a professor and a longtime expert of Russia. He's written many books on Russia, and he's been following this conflict very closely. And he's also very objective. I'm clearly left-wing. I have no problem saying it. I'm absolutely left-wing. Cohen is kind of centrist, but he also is concerned with finding the truth. And he is objective and neutral. And he's been looking at the war in Syria and just been calling out a lot of the nonsense. And there's so much nonsense.
It's unbelievable. Like I believe I preached this on my show. I said, the mainstream media in the United States is nonstop propaganda. Nonstop. Nonstop. Like you can depend on them to tell you what happened, but the how, the why, the who, the what, none of that is reliable. None of that is reliable. Maybe when is reliable, because this happened yesterday. That's reliable. And that happened. That's reliable. But everything around that, the stuff that gives you the context to really understand, they're not reliable. You cannot go there for that information, because basically you're going to end up more misinformed than you are informed about the issue. And I like what you said about Professor Cohen there. That is 100%. He has got a super deep voice too when he's talking. I remember that. I was like, man, this guy's voice is deep. It was a super deep voice. It was like rich. It was calming. And when he was talking, and the other guy was just crazy.
Yeah, Ken Roth is also, he's one of these humanitarian interventionists. He was very similar on Libya. And this is true for many of these human rights organizations. I mean, they still do good work. I'm not denying that. However, there's a revolving door between the nonprofit industrial complex and these NGOs and the State Department very often. And you'll see in groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And that doesn't mean they never do good work, but it means that sometimes, especially when it comes to foreign governments that are being targeted by the US, sometimes what they're saying is not entirely accurate and may be politically motivated in some ways. I'm not saying all of the research, but we should always be skeptical.
Yeah, if anybody has worked for any type of organization that depends upon donations from individuals, particularly big donors like Human Rights Watch, you understand that there are certain areas that they just can't go into. There's certain topics, there's certain things that they can't talk about because donations can be pulled. And I think in that respect, you know, they kind of have to tread the line a little bit. And I take this from not working with, but volunteering for an organization that depends upon donations. There were certain things you can't talk about because it might offend donors and the donations would dry up. I think Human Rights Watch, in many respects, has a lot of ties to big donors that are a part of the establishment to do their good work. And sometimes they have to kind of toe the line, so to speak, to make sure that they can continue to do the good work that they do.
Absolutely. A great example of this. In general, I would say Amnesty International is a bit better than Human Rights Watch, mostly because Human Rights Watch is more US-centered and Amnesty International is more international and focused. It's based in the UK. But as an example of this kind of bias, Amnesty International has released a report, I'll give them credit, on the extremist rebels inside Syria. They released actually a very good report looking at the Salafi jihadist militants in two areas, the major rebel-held areas in Syria, in Aleppo and Idlib. And we're talking about Al-Qaeda and other similar extremist groups like the group Ahrar Sham, Jaish al-Islam, these hardline groups. And Amnesty International detailed in a 55-page report how these extremists have done extrajudicial killings. In the case of Jabhat al-Nusra, Syrian Al-Qaeda, they have carried out public executions of women accused of adultery in the middle of the public square in Idlib. They've also used torture. They've used arbitrary detention against people who oppose them. It's important to have reports on this. There's only one big report on it. And meanwhile, there are countless reports on atrocities committed by the Syrian government. So again, that doesn't mean I'm denying that the Syrian government has committed atrocities, but there's been a laser-like focus on one side, and meanwhile, the other side, which happens to be backed by the CIA, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar and Turkey, the side of the rebels has gotten much less attention, and their extreme crimes have not gotten many media stories.
And it's interesting because there was a report that before all this happened, I forgot when it was, but like, the Gulf states and the United States had a meeting. And in that meeting, Qatar alone was like, hey, we're going to invest $3 billion into building up the infrastructure for the rebels. And they asked to have Pentagon officials come and train people there at their bases. And I was like, this is something that they discussed. And they even discussed that the United States wanted to unilaterally remove the regime, that they would offer to pay a lot of the costs to have that done. And this was in a discussion with, Secretary of State John Kerry. And I was like, this is very, very interesting. I didn't know about that. And that's just something that I pulled up, and I'll post a link to it so that everybody can read about that.
Yeah, but, and another good report
I pulled.
The New York Times also published a great story on how Saudi Arabia has spent billions of dollars helping the U.S. in its program to arm and train Syrian rebels. And there was a kind of deal that was made that's actually very similar to the deal that was made in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And I think more and more people should study this history. I've been trying to link it as much as I can in the interviews I've been doing. In the 1980s, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan made a pact, and they supported extremists, Islamists inside Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen, who were committed to trying to fight to overthrow the government, which was backed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union militarily intervened and launched a brutal decade-long war in the 80s in Afghanistan that led to, hundreds of thousands of deaths. It was horrible. It's very similar in some ways to the war in Syria. And what the US did is the CIA, Pakistani intelligence known as the ISI, and Saudi Arabia spent large sums of money arming and training extremist rebels inside Afghanistan. It's deja vu. It's such a similar example of what we're going through in Syria. And if you look in Syria, it's the same actors. Saudi Arabia is, again, using its enormous oil resources to help pay for the training of many of these rebels who later defected to groups like Al-Qaeda and its extremist allies.
Let me cut for a second and tell everybody that our normal broadcast has ended. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank Ben for spending his time with us. We're just gonna wrap up in a few more minutes here, but that'll also be on the channel, but it won't be aired tonight. So I want to thank everybody for being with the Takedown. I'm just gonna go ahead and plug that.